Hey everyone, tonight we are delving into one of the most captivating and indeed strange epochs in human history, the Victorian era. We are discussing a period characterized by more societal regulations than a monastery, more limitations than a penitentiary, and a greater number of ways to unintentionally damage your reputation than one could possibly imagine. Before you settle in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly value the content I create. Also, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your location. It is always fascinating to observe our global audience. Now, please dim the lights, adjust your pillow for comfort, and allow the world to fade away. Let us embark on tonight's exploration together. We are transporting ourselves back to a time when revealing one's ankle was considered scandalous, when choosing the incorrect fork could sever a friendship, and when a single conversational misstep could socially ostracize you faster than you could utter the phrase, "Good heavens." Envision this, it is 1857 and you have just awakened in London. However, this is not the London you are familiar with. This is a city where every gesture, every utterance and every item of clothing is dictated by an unseen yet unyielding set of principles that would render modern etiquette utterly chaotic. Welcome to Victorian society, where survival was not merely about evading illness or destitution, it was about navigating a social minefield so intricate that a solitary misstep could jeopardize your entire future. This is the chronicle of how ordinary individuals existed, breathed, and somehow persevered in a world where propriety reigned supreme, where one's reputation held more value than precious metals, and where the distinction between respectability and ruin could be as subtle as the manner in which you held your teacup. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, was more than just a temporal segment. It represented a comprehensive system of social governance masquerading as civilization. Named in honor of Queen Victoria, whose reign extended for 63 years and 7 months, this period established the most elaborate, restrictive and remarkably peculiar social codes the world had ever witnessed. But here is what is truly astonishing. People did not merely adhere to these rules, they embraced them, defended them and constructed their very identities around them. Why? Because within Victorian society, your social standing was not merely a matter of comfort or convenience, it was, quite literally, a question of survival. The Victorian social hierarchy functioned like an immense pyramid, with the queen at its apex, followed by the aristocracy, then the upper middle class, the lower middle class, the working class, and finally the impoverished, who were barely acknowledged as human beings by respectable society. However, here is the critical point. Unlike preceding eras where one's birth dictated everything, the Victorian period presented something both novel and daunting – social mobility. For the first time in recorded history, individuals possessed the potential to ascend the social hierarchy. A merchant could attain the status of a gentleman, a clerk could integrate into the middle class, a factory owner could purchase his way into respectability. But, and this is a significant caveat, one could also decline. A single scandal, a solitary transgression of etiquette, a fleeting moment of impropriety, and you could plummet down that ladder with the speed of a Victorian lady swooning at the sight of an uncovered ankle. The potential for both advancement and decline fostered an atmosphere of perpetual apprehension. Everyone scrutinized everyone else, searching for indications of vulnerability, indecorum, or, heaven forbid, vulgarity. The rules were not mere suggestions, they represented the crucial difference between acceptance and ostracism, between prosperity and destitution, between being a person of consequence and being insignificant. The concept of respectability became the ultimate aspiration of Victorian life. But what precisely constituted respectability? It was not solely about possessing wealth. Numerous affluent individuals were deemed vulgar. It was not solely about lineage. Many members of the aristocracy were regarded as dissolute and immoral. Respectability was about demonstrating through every facet of one's conduct that one possessed the moral integrity, self-discipline and refinement that Victorian society valued above all else. Consequently, every action you undertook was a performance. The manner of your dress, your mode of speech, your gait, your eating habits, your hosting practices, even your displays of grief, all of it was expected to conform to an exceptionally precise set of expectations. These expectations were not codified in a handy handbook, they were disseminated through a complex web of social observation, gossip, and an unspoken understanding that you were simply expected to internalize. The pressure was immense. Victorian diaries and correspondence are replete with expressions of anxiety concerning social missteps, fears of being exposed as insufficiently respectable, and desperate attempts to decipher the ever-shifting dictates of proper conduct. Individuals invested substantial sums in acquiring the appropriate attire, furnishings, and an esteemed address, all in the service of maintaining their position within this elaborate social theater. Yet perhaps the most insidious facet of Victorian respectability was how it transformed everyone into both an actor and an audience. You were not merely attempting to adhere to the rules, you were also constantly evaluating others on their compliance with those same rules. This engendered a society of mutual scrutiny, where each individual was simultaneously observed and observing, judged and judging. The ramifications of failure were dire. Social exclusion could precipitate financial ruin, as business connections, employment prospects, and even essential services could be withheld from those who had fallen from favor. For women, the stakes were even more profound. A tarnished reputation could signify a life of spinsterhood, poverty, and complete social isolation. Nevertheless, despite, or perhaps because of these immense pressures, Victorian society gave rise to some of the most intricate, inventive, and decidedly peculiar social customs in recorded history. They transformed everyday activities such as visiting, dining, and even mourning into complex rituals that demanded years of mastery and constant vigilance to uphold. Your day as a respectable Victorian commenced even before you opened your eyes. This is because your waking process, your attire, and your preparation for the day ahead were all subject to the stringent laws of propriety. The morning routine was not merely about preparing yourself, it was about transforming yourself from a mere human being into a proper Victorian lady or gentleman. Let us begin with the ladies, whose morning ritual was nothing short of an architectural endeavor. A Victorian woman did not simply dress, she was meticulously assembled, layer by layer, into the approved feminine form. The process initiated with the chemise, a lengthy linen undergarment extending from neck to ankles. This was not merely underclothing, it served as the very foundation of respectability, ensuring that no part of her actual body would come into direct contact with her outer garments. Next came the corset, and oh, the corset. This was not simply an article of clothing, it was a torture instrument disguised as fashion. Constructed from whalebone, steel or cane and laced with such severity that respiration became a deliberate act, the corset was engineered to achieve the quintessential Victorian silhouette, a waist so diminutive it appeared as though it might fracture in a strong gust of wind. Women frequently fainted from oxygen deprivation, developed permanent rib deformities, and suffered from what physicians delicately termed corset liver, a condition involving actual organ displacement due to sustained pressure. However, here lies the truly astonishing aspect. Women defended the corset. They contended that it provided support, that it was essential for proper posture, and that it was indispensable for respectability. The reasoning? A woman without a corset was considered improperly attired, indecent, and precariously close to being a fallen woman. The corset was not merely about appearance, it symbolized moral character. A woman tightly corseted was a woman under control, and control was the very essence of Victorian virtue. Following the corset came the bustle, a framework of wire, whalebone or horsehair that dramatically extended the skirt behind the wearer. The bustle underwent several evolutionary stages throughout the Victorian era, at times exaggerating the skirt to such preposterous proportions that sitting down became a complex logistical challenge. Women were compelled to learn to navigate doorways sideways, to perch on the very edge of chairs, and to walk in a manner that prevented their voluminous skirts from toppling furniture, small children, or other women. The dress itself was merely the commencement of this intricate process. Victorian fashion necessitated numerous layers: the chemise, the corset, the bustle, the petticoats, often several in number, the dress and subsequently the accessories. Gloves were obligatory. A lady never appeared in public with bare hands, as this was deemed nearly as scandalous as being unclothed. The gloves had to be of the correct length for the specific occasion, the appropriate color to complement the outfit, and the suitable material for the prevailing season. Hats were equally demanding. A Victorian lady never departed her residence without a hat, and the hat had to be suitable for the time of day, the season, the event, and her social standing. Morning hats differed from afternoon hats, which in turn differed from evening hats. The incorrect hat could label one as either ostentatious, if it was too elaborate for the occasion, or unkempt, if it was overly simplistic. Hair represented perhaps the most intricate element of the morning ritual. Victorian hairstyles were elaborate constructions that could consume hours to fashion and necessitated the assistance of a maid or family member. Hair was never worn unbound in public. That was indicative of a child or a woman of questionable morals. Instead, it was meticulously pinned, twisted, braided, and arranged into complex styles requiring dozens of hairpins and often additional padding or false hair to achieve the desired volume. For gentlemen, the morning ritual was comparatively less complex, yet no less significant. The Victorian gentleman was expected to maintain impeccable grooming at all times. This necessitated a daily clean shave or the meticulous upkeep of a beard or mustache, hair precisely coiffed and secured with pomade, and attire that was immaculate, pressed and fitting for the day's planned endeavors. The Victorian gentleman's wardrobe was a demonstration of subtle yet significant differences. Morning attire was distinct from that worn in the afternoon, which in turn differed from evening wear. Professional clothing was separate from that deemed suitable for social occasions. Garments for the countryside were not the same as those for urban settings. Each ensemble had particular stipulations regarding fabric, color, cut, and accessories. Wearing an inappropriate item could instantly identify an individual as either lacking in proper knowledge or, more damagingly, as ostentatious. The morning toilette also encompassed attention to personal cleanliness, though prevailing Victorian notions of hygiene differed considerably from those of today. Many physicians deemed daily ablutions to be detrimental to one's health, believing excessive washing could weaken the body's constitution. Instead, people relied on what was termed dry cleaning, which involved brushing hair and clothing, washing the face and hands, and changing undergarments. Breakfast represented the day's initial social trial, and even this seemingly simple meal was subject to intricate regulations. The manner in which one held a teacup, the sequence of consuming food, and the subjects deemed appropriate for morning conversation were all meticulously prescribed. A solitary transgression of breakfast etiquette could establish the groundwork for social ruin throughout the entire day. The morning regimen also included the perusal of a newspaper, but even this activity was governed by social dictates. Ladies were expected to confine their reading to specific sections, such as the society pages or perhaps literary reviews, but were strictly forbidden from engaging with news concerning business or politics, which were considered too unfeminine for their sensibilities. Gentlemen, conversely, were expected to be well informed regarding current events, as such knowledge was considered indispensable for engaging in appropriate conversation throughout the day. By the time a proper Victorian gentleman had concluded his morning preparations, he had already navigated countless potential social embarrassments and evinced his command of the complex codes that dictated every facet of daily existence, and the day had only just commenced. If you found the process of dressing to be intricate, just wait until you learn about the Victorian practice of social visits known as calling. This was far from a casual drop-in to exchange pleasantries. It constituted an elaborate social ritual that held the power to either forge or fracture relationships, determine one's standing in society, and, quite literally, decide whether one would be embraced or cast out by their community. The calling system was founded upon a straightforward principle. Respectable individuals did not simply appear at each other's residences without prior arrangement. Instead, they adhered to a sophisticated protocol involving calling cards, designated days for receiving guests, precise timing, and a multitude of unspoken rules that everyone was presumed to grasp intuitively. Let us begin with calling cards, as these small pieces of cardboard essentially functioned as the social media of the Victorian era. A calling card was a diminutive, elegantly printed card bearing one's name and, if married, one's address. However, the card itself was merely the starting point. The manner in which it was utilized, when it was left, and how one responded to the cards of others were all components of an intricate social ballet. When you sought to initiate a social connection with someone, you did not simply knock on their door. Rather, you would leave your calling card with their servant, thereby signaling your intention to be received. If the individual was at home to visitors, which did not necessarily imply their physical presence but rather their willingness to entertain callers, they would reciprocate your visit within a specified time frame, typically within a week. But here's where the complexity deepens. There existed various types of calls, each accompanied by its own set of regulations and implications. A first call differed from a return call, which was distinct from a condolence call, and further distinct from a congratulatory call. The duration allocated for each call was strictly defined: 15 minutes for a first call, 20 minutes for a return call, and so forth. Lingering beyond the allotted time was deemed impolite and intrusive. Departing too precipitately was considered an affront. The timing of calls was equally intricate. Morning calls, which paradoxically occurred in the afternoon, were the most formal and were typically conducted between 2 and 5 o'clock. Evening calls were more informal and could extend for longer periods. Sunday calls were reserved for close companions and family members, and certain days were designated for particular categories of individuals to receive visitors. Mondays for professional contacts, Tuesdays for social acquaintances, and so on. The physical act of calling was a performance in its own right. One arrived in their finest carriage, or at least the most respectable one they could afford, attired in their most elegant calling costume and accompanied by the requisite number of servants. Your coachman would announce your arrival, and you would be escorted into the drawing room to await reception. The conversation during a call was as meticulously choreographed as a ballet. Certain topics were deemed appropriate for calling discourse, while others were absolutely proscribed. Discussions about the weather were always permissible, as were general inquiries about health and family. Literature and art were acceptable subjects, provided one did not express opinions that were overly strong or contentious. Politics, business, and any matter of a personal nature were strictly prohibited. Yet perhaps the most intricate dimension of the calling system lay in the subtle methods through which social messages could be conveyed. If an individual was reported as not being at home when you called, even if they were visibly present through a window, it served as a polite indication that they wished to discontinue the social acquaintance. If someone returned your call but left their card without requesting to see you, it was a means of fulfilling their social obligation, while simultaneously signaling a lack of interest in a more intimate friendship. The calling card itself could transmit messages through subtle adjustments in its presentation. A card with a corner folded down signified that the caller had visited in person rather than dispatching a servant. Different folded corners carried distinct meanings, one for congratulations, another for condolences, and so forth. The quality of the cardstock, the style of the printing, and even the dimensions of the card all communicated messages concerning one's social standing and personal taste. For women, the calling system held particular significance, as it represented one of the few avenues available for establishing and maintaining social connections beyond their immediate family circle. A woman's calling list served as a reflection of her social position, and its removal from someone's list could have dire social repercussions. The system also exhibited seasonal variations. During the London social season, which typically ran from Easter until August, calling evolved into an almost full-time occupation for fashionable ladies. They would dedicate their afternoons to making numerous calls, carefully orchestrating their visits to maximize their social visibility while assiduously avoiding any breaches of etiquette. Furthermore, specific protocols were applied to different types of households. Calling upon a family in mourning necessitated distinct procedures compared to visiting a newlywed couple, which differed from calling on a family with unmarried daughters. Each circumstance presented its own array of expectations and taboos. The calling system extended beyond individual relationships to encompass formal social gatherings. At homes were designated receiving days when a hostess would be available to welcome callers, often providing refreshments and occasionally entertainment. These events were vital for preserving one's standing within society and for introducing new individuals to the social circle. The inherent complexity of the calling system led many individuals to employ social secretaries or consult etiquette manuals to navigate its intricacies. Errors could prove costly. Calling on the wrong day, overstaying one's welcome, or neglecting to reciprocate a call promptly could result in social exclusion. However, perhaps the most striking aspect of the calling system was its capacity to transform simple human interaction into an elaborate ritual demanding years to master and continuous vigilance to uphold. It was a system that simultaneously fostered connections between people while maintaining distinct separations, creating bonds while preserving stringent boundaries. If you believed calling to be complicated, imagine Victorian dining as navigating a minefield while blindfolded, juggling simultaneously and reciting poetry. The dining room was not merely a venue for sustenance. It was the ultimate proving ground for social acceptability, where a single misstep with cutlery could irrevocably brand you as utterly unrefined and undo years of diligent social advancement. The Victorian dinner party stood as the zenith of social performance, a meticulously orchestrated affair that could span several hours and involve more regulations than a military campaign. Every element, from the seating arrangement to the final toast, was governed by rigid protocols presumed to be known instinctively by all attendees. Let us commence with the invitation, for even the act of being invited to a Victorian dinner party constituted a complex social negotiation. Invitations had to be dispatched precisely 2 weeks in advance, not 13 days, not 15 days, but exactly 14 days. The invitation itself was required to be penned on the finest stationery, rendered in the most elegant script and phrased according to specific templates that afforded no latitude for creativity or personal expression. The selection of guests involved a delicate equilibrium of social considerations. One could not invite individuals who were embroiled in disputes. The mixing of social classes had to be executed with great care, and it was imperative to ensure that the conversation would flow harmoniously, leaving no one feeling excluded or offended. The number of guests was also of paramount importance. Too few, and the gathering would appear insignificant. Too many, and it would be perceived as vulgar and ostentatious. Upon arrival at the dinner party, the true performance commenced. The seating arrangement was a complex puzzle that mirrored and reinforced social hierarchies. The host occupied one extremity of the table, with the hostess at the opposing end. The most esteemed male attendee was positioned to the hostess's right, and the most esteemed female attendee to the host's right. All other individuals were positioned according to their social standing, age, and relationship to the hosts. However, here lies the truly astonishing aspect. Guests were forbidden to sit until all had been correctly placed according to this intricate hierarchy. Consequently, guests would frequently stand around the dining room for a duration of 10 to 15 minutes, while the hostess mentally devised the proper placement and directed individuals to their seats, much like chess pieces. The table setting itself was an artistic creation that would necessitate an engineering degree to comprehend. A proper Victorian place setting could comprise as many as 12 distinct pieces of silverware, each designated for a particular course and each possessing its own established rules for appropriate use. There were soup spoons and dessert spoons, fish forks and meat forks, butter knives and fruit knives. Employing the incorrect utensil for a given course was deemed a severe breach of etiquette, which would be observed and recollected by everyone present. The glassware was equally intricate. Separate glasses might be provided for water, white wine, red wine, champagne and sherry, each situated in a specific position relative to the plate and to each other. The correct method for holding each type of glass varied, and consuming from the wrong glass at the inappropriate moment could signify one as hopelessly unsophisticated. The meal itself was presented in multiple courses, typically ranging from 7 to 12 for a formal dinner party. Each course adhered to its own set of rules, utilized specific utensils, and entailed distinct conversational expectations. The soup course necessitated silent, careful sipping without any audible slurping. The fish course demanded the use of specialized fish knives and forks. Ordinary knives were believed to adversely affect the delicate flavor of the fish. The meat course involved complex carving ceremonies and particular methods for requesting specific cuts. However, perhaps the most demanding element of Victorian dining was the conversation. One was expected to converse with the individual to their right during the initial course, then turn to the person on their left for the second course, continuing to alternate throughout the meal. This practice, known as turning the table, was orchestrated by the hostess, who would supply subtle cues indicating when it was time to change conversational partners. The subjects of conversation were regulated as stringently as the silverware. Politics, religion, business, and any remotely personal matters were strictly prohibited. Instead, one was expected to engage in light, enjoyable discourse on safe themes such as the weather, literature, though nothing too controversial unless its nature was carefully considered, art, avoiding anything excessively modern, and travel, refraining from subjects that were too exotic or adventurous. The challenge lay in being engaging without being contentious, witty without being sharp-tongued, and knowledgeable without being overly didactic. One had to showcase their education and sophistication without appearing boastful or dominating the conversation. It was a delicate equilibrium that required years of practice to master. Women encountered additional complexities at the dinner table. They were expected to consume very little, taking diminutive bites and leaving food on their plates to signify their delicate appetites and refined sensibilities. A woman who ate heartily was regarded as uncouth and unfeminine. They also had to manage their elaborate attire while eating, ensuring their sleeves did not dip into the soup and their bustles did not inadvertently strike other guests when they turned to address different conversational partners. The service itself was a complex choreography involving numerous servants trained in the precise rituals of formal dining. Dishes were served from the left and cleared from the right. Wine glasses were filled to particular levels contingent on the type of wine. Bread was broken, never cut. Salt was never passed directly from one hand to another, but was placed on the table for the recipient to retrieve. Even the manner in which one held their utensils was subject to stringent regulations. The continental style, with a fork in the left hand and a knife in the right, was considered more refined than the American style, which involved switching the fork to the right hand after cutting. One's posture had to be impeccable, back straight, elbows off the table, hands visible but not gesturing excessively. The conclusion of the meal was as ritualized as its commencement. The ladies would retire to the drawing room for coffee and light conversation, while the gentlemen remained at the table for port, cigars, and more serious discussions. This segregation of the sexes was considered essential for maintaining proper social order. Ladies were deemed too delicate for the rougher conversation of men, and men required time to discuss business and politics without the inhibiting influence of feminine sensitivities. When the gentlemen eventually joined the ladies in the drawing room, there might be entertainment such as piano playing, singing, or parlor games. However, even these activities were governed by strict rules concerning who could perform, the appropriateness of the pieces, and the duration of each performance. The evening would ultimately conclude with elaborate departure rituals. Guests were required to thank their hosts in the exact manner, express their enjoyment of the evening without excessive effusiveness, and make their farewells in the correct order dictated by social rank. A successful dinner party represented a triumph of social engineering, a demonstration that the hosts possessed not only the wealth to provide elaborate entertainment, but also the knowledge, taste, and social connections necessary to orchestrate a flawless evening. A failed dinner party, one where conversation faltered, service was imperfect, or guests appeared ill at ease, could potentially harm a family's social standing for months or even years. Victorian society was preoccupied with hidden meanings, secret codes, and subtle communications that enabled individuals to convey sentiments and intentions that could not be articulated openly in polite company. Two of the most elaborate of these coded languages were the language of flowers and the language of fans. These were complex systems of symbolic communication expected to be mastered by every respectable Victorian. The language of flowers, or floriography, was perhaps the most romantic and intricate of these coded systems. In a society where the direct expression of emotion was deemed vulgar and improper, flowers offered a means to communicate feelings that could not be voiced. However, this was not simply a matter of roses signifying love. The Victorian floral language was exceptionally precise and nuanced, with distinct meanings attributed to different colors, varying numbers of flowers, and even differing methods of presentation. A red rose, for instance, conveyed passionate love, while a white rose signified pure love. A yellow rose indicated friendship, and a pink rose expressed gratitude or admiration. Yet it extended further. The quantity of roses also held significance. A single rose implied, "You are my one and only," whereas a dozen roses meant, "Be mine." Two roses bound together symbolized an engagement, while a bouquet of roses with thorns removed communicated, "I have nothing to fear from you." Roses, however, were merely the beginning. Every flower possessed its own meaning, and many harbored multiple interpretations depending on the context. Forget-me-nots denoted true love and remembrance, but they could also signify "do not forget me" when given by someone departing. Daisies represented innocence and purity, but they could also mean "I will consider it" when offered in response to a proposal. Violets signified modesty and faithfulness, but specifically, purple violets conveyed "you occupy my thoughts." The complexity did not cease with individual flowers. The way flowers were combined in a bouquet could form intricate messages. A bouquet of red roses and white lilies might communicate "my passionate love for you is pure and honorable." A combination of forget-me-nots and rosemary, which meant remembrance, could convey "remember our love always." Even the manner in which flowers were presented carried meaning. Flowers given upside down signified the opposite of their usual meaning. Thus, an inverted red rose suggested "I do not love you" rather than "I love you passionately." Flowers presented with the right hand meant yes, while those presented with the left hand meant no. A flower worn over the heart indicated love, while a flower worn in the hair suggested caution. The timing of flower presentation was also significant. Flowers given in the morning held different meanings than those given in the evening. Flowers presented on specific days of the week carried additional messages. The Victorian floral language was so intricate that entire dictionaries were published to assist individuals in deciphering the meanings of various floral arrangements. Flowers, however, were not the sole coded language employed by Victorians. The language of fans was equally elaborate and perhaps even more practical, as a lady always carried a fan and could utilize it to communicate throughout social events without others comprehending her messages. A fan held in the right hand in front of the face meant "follow me", while a fan held in the left hand in front of the face indicated "I wish to speak to you". A fan drawn across the cheek signified "I love you", while a fan drawn across the forehead meant "we are being observed". A fan placed near the heart indicated "you have captured my love", whereas a fan placed on the right ear suggested "you have changed". The way a fan was opened and closed also conveyed meaning. A fan opened and shut rapidly meant "you are cruel", while a fan opened wide indicated "wait for me". A fan closed and held against the heart signified "you have won my love", while a fan half opened meant "we are friends". Even the number of ribs on a fan could hold significance, and the embellishments on the fan could introduce additional layers of symbolism. A fan adorned with blossoms served to merge the lexicon of fans with the language of flowers, thus forging exceptionally intricate messages decipherable only by those who had achieved proficiency in both systems. These clandestine linguistic frameworks were not merely amorous pastimes. They constituted vital instruments for conveying sentiments in a society that strictly inhibited the overt expression of emotions or intentions. Younger individuals employed them to conduct romantic overtures under the diligent supervision of chaperones. Married women utilized them to converse with companions and acquaintances on delicate subjects that could not be openly discussed. Even commercial dealings occasionally depended upon these unobtrusive methods of interaction. The proficiency in these languages was regarded as a hallmark of sophistication and erudition. A young woman incapable of interpreting a floral communication or understanding fan signals was deemed poorly educated and socially unsophisticated. Books on etiquette dedicated entire sections to these symbolic languages, and young people invested considerable time in mastering the significations of diverse blossoms and fan gestures. However, the complexity of these frameworks also engendered potential for misinterpretations and social catastrophes. A flower presented with innocent intent could be construed as a fervent declaration of love. A fan movement intended as amicable might be perceived as romantic encouragement. The likelihood of communication breakdown was immense, and the attendant social repercussions could be grave. The encrypted languages also mirrored the pervasive Victorian fascination with veiled meanings and symbolic communication. Victorians perceived symbolism in every aspect of life, in architecture, sartorial choices, adornments, and domestic ornamentation. They held that every object possessed a significance extending beyond its superficial appearance, and they devoted substantial time and effort to unraveling these concealed messages. This preoccupation with veiled communication also reflected the restrictive character of Victorian society. When direct expression was either forbidden or perilous, individuals devised ingenious strategies for indirect communication. The language of flowers and fans were merely two illustrations of the numerous methods Victorians developed to articulate what remained unsaid. The widespread appeal of these languages also gave rise to an entire commercial sector devoted to guidebooks, lexicons, and instructional resources. Publishers produced elaborate compilations elucidating the meanings of various flowers, appropriate floral arrangements, and correct fan communication techniques. These volumes achieved bestseller status, attesting to the profound demand for such symbolic erudition. If one considers present-day romantic pursuits to be intricate, then Victorian courtship resembled a game of chess played blindfolded underwater with one's hands bound behind one's back. The process of selecting a spouse within Victorian society was so encumbered by regulations, constraints, and societal expectations that it seems remarkable that anyone managed to marry at all. The Victorian courtship ritual commenced long before any actual romantic engagement transpired. Parents, particularly mothers, dedicated years to preparing their daughters for the matrimonial arena, imparting to them the accomplishments that would render them alluring to prospective suitors. These accomplishments encompassed musical proficiency on the piano, vocal artistry, fluency in French, watercolor painting, and engaging in facile discourse. All these skills were designed to showcase refinement and femininity without implying any practical aptitude or independent thought. Young women were also instructed in the art of being captivating without being forward, interesting without being overly intellectual, and attractive without being overtly seductive. This represented a delicate equilibrium necessitating years of practice and perpetual attentiveness. A young woman who was excessively reserved risked being overlooked, whereas one who was too vivacious would be deemed improper. An individual exhibiting excessive seriousness would be perceived as dull, while one displaying undue frivolity would be regarded as shallow. The advent into society, or coming out, constituted a young lady's formal introduction to society and the marriage market. This typically occurred around her 18th birthday and involved a series of elaborate social functions orchestrated to present her to potential suitors and their families. The debutante ball marked the apex of this process, a formal event at which the young lady was presented to society and officially declared eligible for courtship. Nevertheless, even after her societal debut, a young lady could not simply engage with young men at will. All interactions were subject to meticulous oversight and regulation. A gentleman harboring an interest in a particular young lady was obliged to first secure an introduction through mutual acquaintances or family members. He could not arbitrarily approach her at a social gathering and initiate a conversation. Such an action would be deemed inappropriate and potentially scandalous. Once an introduction was established, the gentleman could petition for permission to visit the young lady at her family residence. However, these visits were subject to stringent supervision. The young lady's mother or another female relative was invariably present, and conversations were confined to innocuous general subjects. Any attempt at private discourse or the discussion of personal matters would be immediately curtailed. Should the gentleman's attentions be favorably received, he might be invited to accompany the young lady to social functions, but invariably under chaperonage. A young couple was never permitted to be unaccompanied, not even for brief intervals. The chaperone's mandate was to ensure that no impropriety occurred and that the young lady's reputation remained unblemished. The courtship phase could extend over months or even years, with the relationship progressing through meticulously defined stages. Initially, there were formal calls, followed by escorted outings and potentially the exchange of minor tokens. Floral gifts were permissible, but jewelry was not. Finally, under favorable circumstances, the gentleman would solicit the young lady's father's consent to propose marriage. The proposal itself was a formal undertaking governed by strict protocols. The gentleman was required to seek the father's sanction before formally proposing to the daughter. If the father assented, the gentleman could then proceed with his proposal, executed with decorum, on bended knee, accompanied by a formal address and the presentation of a ring, though engagement rings of the era were less elaborate than their contemporary counterparts. Upon acceptance, the couple became formally betrothed. Yet even then, their interactions remained subject to strict controls. They could spend time together, but always with chaperonage. They could exchange correspondence, which might be subject to parental review. They could bestow gifts upon one another, provided these were deemed appropriate and not overly personal. The engagement period served the purpose of wedding arrangements and facilitated familial acquaintance. Simultaneously, it was a time of heightened scrutiny, as both families assessed the suitability of the match. Engagements could be dissolved if complications arose, although such dissolutions were regarded as serious matters that could negatively impact the reputations of both parties. The wedding ceremony itself was a grand affair, reflecting the family's social standing and financial capacity. The service adhered to stringent protocols with specific stipulations regarding the bride's attire, the groom's ensemble, the number and selection of attendants, and the style of the reception. The bride's gown was typically white, a custom popularized by Queen Victoria's choice of white for her own wedding. Crafted from the finest available materials, it was intended to signify both the bride's purity and her family's affluence. The gown was often so ornate and costly that it represented a considerable financial commitment for the family. The wedding ceremony itself was a religious observance that underscored the bride's deference to her husband and her forthcoming role as a wife and prospective mother. The traditional vows included the bride's pledge to love, honor, and obey her husband, reflecting the legal and social reality that married women possessed minimal rights independent of their husbands. Following the nuptials, the couple would typically embark on a honeymoon, a relatively novel concept during the Victorian era. The honeymoon was conceived as a period for the couple to privately acquaint themselves and commence their marital journey away from the intense scrutiny of family and friends. However, even matrimony did not abrogate societal strictures. Victorian wives were expected to excel as hostesses, devoted mothers, and supportive partners to their husbands. They were tasked with managing complex households, nurturing social connections, and raising children in accordance with the rigorous Victorian standards, all while maintaining an outward appearance of effortless grace and contentment. The entirety of the courtship and matrimonial process was designed to ensure that unions were founded upon social compatibility and familial approval, rather than romantic affection. While affection might potentially blossom within marriage, it was not deemed a prerequisite for a successful partnership. The crucial elements were that both individuals comprehended their respective roles and obligations and were committed to fulfilling them in accordance with Victorian expectations. The system yielded marriages that were frequently stable and socially sanctioned, yet it also imposed immense pressure on young individuals to conform to expectations that might diverge from their personal desires or inclinations. The emphasis on propriety and social acceptance resulted in numerous individuals entering into unions that more closely resembled business arrangements than romantic partnerships, with each party assuming carefully delineated roles rather than expressing their authentic selves. The ramifications of deviating from courtship conventions were severe, particularly for women. A young lady perceived as overly bold, excessively independent, or too inclined to disregard the rules risked being labeled as fast or improper, social death sentences that would render her unmarriageable. Even unintentional errors could prove catastrophic. Being observed alone with a young man, even briefly, could irrevocably damage a girl's reputation. For men, the stakes were somewhat reduced, yet they still encountered considerable social pressure to adhere to expectations. A young man who neglected to follow appropriate courtship procedures might be perceived as ungentlemanly or socially clumsy, which could jeopardize his prospects not only for matrimony but also for commercial and social advancement. This system also generated immense anxiety for parents who recognized that their children's future contentment and social standing hinged upon successfully navigating these intricate regulations. Mothers dedicated years to instructing their daughters in proper deportment, while fathers meticulously assessed prospective husbands to confirm their suitability as partners. The financial dimensions of Victorian matrimony were likewise intricate and highly regulated. Marriage settlements, dowries, and inheritance agreements were carefully negotiated amongst families, frequently with the assistance of legal professionals and financial consultants. These negotiations could be as consequential as the emotional accord between the couple, and unions were at times arranged or facilitated primarily on the basis of financial considerations. Death within Victorian society was more than just a personal calamity. It constituted a social occasion that necessitated elaborate ceremonies, particular attire, and carefully managed demonstrations of sorrow that could persist for years. The Victorian approach to bereavement was so intricate and demanding that it effectively established a distinct stratum of individuals attired in black, adhering to customs which rendered ordinary social etiquette seemingly simplistic by comparison. The Victorian process of mourning commenced the instant a person passed away and could continue for years afterward, with different stages requiring distinct behaviors, varied clothing, and specific social limitations. The duration and intensity of mourning were contingent upon one's association with the departed. A widow might grieve for 2.5 years, whereas a distant relative might observe merely 6 months of tempered mourning. Let us commence with the widow, as her mourning obligations were the most detailed and arduous. Upon the demise of a Victorian woman's husband, she effectively vanished from conventional society, entering a somber realm governed entirely by the tenets of grief. For the initial period of 1 year and 1 day, she observed deep mourning, which mandated wearing nothing but black, and not just any black, but particular varieties of black fabric adorned with specific types of trim and ornamentation. The deep mourning attire was fashioned from materials such as bombazine, crepe, or merino wool, all in the deepest, most light-absorbing black achievable. The garment had to be entirely unadorned, save for specific classifications of black trim, including jet beads or black ribbon. Even undergarments were required to be black. The widow's adornments were confined to jet black enamel or mourning jewelry crafted from the hair of the deceased. Indeed, jewelry was fashioned from the hair of deceased individuals, and this was regarded as the pinnacle of sentimental fashion. The widow's social engagements during the period of deep mourning were significantly curtailed. She was barred from attending festivities, theatrical performances, or any form of entertainment. She could not receive callers apart from immediate family members. She was even prohibited from patronizing shops for any purpose other than acquiring necessities, and then only at designated establishments catering to mourning clientele. Her world contracted to her residence, her place of worship, and the cemetery. Following the initial year and day, the widow entered a phase of second mourning, which lasted for 9 months. During this interval, she was permitted to incorporate small amounts of white, grey, or purple into her attire, although black remained the predominant hue. She could resume receiving visitors, but solely for condolence calls, and was still forbidden from attending any form of entertainment or social assembly. The final stage was half mourning, which persisted for 6 months. In this period, the widow could don grey, purple and white garments, though black was still favored. She could begin to partake in subdued social engagements, yet any activities deemed excessively festive or joyful were still disallowed. Only after completing the full 2.5 years of solemn observance could a widow revert to her customary attire and social pursuits. However, widows were not the sole individuals subject to elaborate mourning protocols. Children mourning a parent were obliged to observe deep mourning for 1 year, followed by 6 months of half mourning. Parents grieving a child, adherence to the same schedule. Siblings mourning one another were required to undertake 6 months of deep mourning, succeeded by 6 months of half mourning. Even more distant relations had specific mourning obligations. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins all had designated periods of modified dress and conduct. The mourning requirements extended beyond mere clothing to encompass every facet of daily existence. Mourning stationery was mandated for all correspondence. Paper featuring black borders that progressively narrowed as the mourning period advanced. Even envelopes were required to bear black borders, and the wax used for sealing letters had to be black rather than the customary red. Mourning jewelry constituted an elaborate art form in its own right. In addition to jet and black enamel pieces, Victorians created intricate jewelry from the hair of the departed. Hair was braided, woven, and fashioned into brooches, rings, bracelets, and even elaborate wreaths and portraits. These hair ornaments were frequently combined with gold, pearls, or other precious materials to produce beautiful yet macabre keepsakes of the deceased. The home itself had to be transformed for the period of mourning. Mirrors were draped with black fabric or turned to face the wall. Clocks were halted at the hour of death. Windows were veiled with black crepe. Even the doorbell was muffled to prevent its ringing from sounding overly cheerful. The entire dwelling became a sanctuary of sorrow, designed to remind all who entered that death had visited this family. Mourning photography gained prominence during the Victorian era, with families commissioning formal portraits of the deceased, often posed as if in slumber. These post-mortem photographs were cherished family heirlooms and were displayed prominently within the home. Living relatives would also pose alongside the deceased for final family portraits, a practice that appears morbid in contemporary times, but was considered a standard and significant aspect of the grieving process. The funeral itself was an elaborate public demonstration, reflecting the family's social standing and their devotion to the departed. Victorian funerals could involve elaborate processions with professional mourners, ornate hearses drawn by black horses adorned with black plumes, and ceremonies that extended for hours. The greater the prominence of the deceased, the more ostentatious the funeral was expected to be. Funeral invitations were dispatched on special black-bordered stationery, and the guest list was meticulously compiled to include all individuals whose presence was deemed appropriate, while excluding those whose attendance might be unsuitable. The funeral service itself adhered to strict protocols, with specific mandates for music, floral arrangements, and eulogies. The cemetery evolved into a significant social locale during the Victorian era, distinguished by elaborate monuments and regular visits from mourning families. Victorian cemeteries were designed as parks, providing families with spaces to commune with their deceased loved ones, and visiting the cemetery became a customary social activity for those in mourning. Children were not exempt from mourning obligations, although their periods of bereavement were typically shorter than those mandated for adults. Even very young children were attired in black and expected to conduct themselves appropriately during the mourning period. This early immersion in elaborate mourning rituals was considered an essential component of their moral upbringing. The economic ramifications of Victorian mourning were substantial. Entire industries emerged to cater to mourning families: specialized seamstresses who crafted mourning apparel, jewelers who fashioned mourning adornments, stationers who produced mourning paper goods, and funeral directors who orchestrated elaborate ceremonies. For numerous families, the expenditure required for proper mourning could prove financially ruinous. However, failure to observe the correct forms was deemed even more reprehensible. The mourning requirements also fostered a secondary market for mourning goods. Families would frequently sell their mourning attire and jewelry once the mourning period concluded, and other families would acquire these items for their own periods of grief. This gave rise to a complex economy surrounding death and bereavement that permeated every echelon of Victorian society. The psychological consequence of these elaborate mourning mandates was considerable. While they offered structure and societal support to grieving families, they also prolonged and intensified the mourning experience. Widows in particular might find themselves ensnared in a cycle of sorrow that impeded their ability to move forward with their lives. Victorian children were not merely miniature adults. They constituted an entirely distinct category of human beings, possessing their own elaborate framework of rules, limitations, and expectations. Childhood in the Victorian era was simultaneously idealized and rigorously controlled, with children anticipated to be innocent and pure, while also exhibiting impeccable conduct and adult-level self-restraint. The Victorian conception of childhood was profoundly shaped by religious convictions concerning original sin and moral development. Children were viewed as inherently impious beings who required meticulous training and discipline to mature into proper Christian adults. Consequently, every aspect of a child's existence, from their clothing to their pastimes to their education, was designed to mold their moral character and prepare them for their future societal roles. Victorian children's attire mirrored adult fashion on a smaller scale, complete with all the associated discomfort and restriction. Young girls wore corsets from a tender age, though these were somewhat less constricting than adult versions. They also wore multiple layers of petticoats and long dresses that hindered running and playing. Young boys, up until around 4 or 5 years of age, wore dresses. At that point in their lives, they underwent a ceremony known as, quote, zero, where they received their first pair of trousers. This event signified their transition from infancy into boyhood. The clothing worn by children was not solely a matter of outward appearance, it served as a tool for training them in proper conduct. The restrictive nature of Victorian children's attire made it difficult for them to move with freedom or engage in boisterous play, and this was intentional. Children were expected to remain seated, walk with composure, and exhibit the same level of decorum as adults. Daily routines for children were highly structured, with designated times for meals, lessons, play, and rest. Typically, they consumed their meals in the nursery rather than with their parents, and their food was simple and unsubstantial. No spices, no rich dishes, nothing that could potentially overstimulate their developing characters. The underlying philosophy was that children should learn to find contentment in modest pleasures and avoid developing extravagant or luxurious tastes. Education was regarded with great seriousness, yet it was distinctly divided by gender from an early age. Boys were prepared for professions in fields such as business, law, medicine or the military, while girls were educated for their future roles as wives and mothers. Boys pursued studies in Latin, Greek, mathematics and science, whereas girls concentrated on areas like music, drawing, the French language and domestic arts. The nursery served as the focal point of a Victorian child's existence and was meticulously designed to foster appropriate moral development. Nursery decorations commonly featured religious motifs or instilled moral lessons. Children's books were replete with narratives about well-behaved children who were rewarded for their virtue and ill-behaved children who faced dire repercussions for their misconduct. Toys were selected for their educational and moral value rather than their capacity for entertainment. Dolls were intended to educate girls about motherhood and domestic responsibilities. Construction blocks and mechanical toys were devised to enhance boys' spatial reasoning and comprehension of mechanics. Even games were expected to impart moral instruction or practical abilities. Playtime was subject to close supervision and regulation. Children were not permitted to play freely or create noise that might disturb adults. Their games were required to be quiet, orderly and instructive. Boisterous play, loud exclamations and spontaneous actions were all discouraged, as they were considered indicators of poor upbringing and insufficient moral training. The relationship between Victorian children and their parents, by contemporary standards, was formal and distant. Children were expected to address their parents as mother and father or mama and papa, never using their given names. They were mandated to stand when adults entered the room, to speak only when addressed, and to maintain impeccable manners at all times. Physical displays of affection between parents and children were limited and formal. Excessive expressions of emotion were believed to be detrimental to children's moral development. Parents were advised to maintain a loving yet firm detachment from their offspring, offering guidance and correction without becoming overly emotionally entangled. Discipline was rigorous and frequently severe. Victorian parents subscribed to the belief that failing to discipline would lead to a spoiled child, and physical punishment was deemed not only acceptable but essential for proper moral development. Children who exhibited misbehavior might face spanking, prolonged periods of standing in corners, or the deprivation of meals as corrective measures. The notion of childhood innocence was fundamental to the Victorian perspective on children. However, this innocence had to be carefully safeguarded and preserved. Children were kept unaware of any matters pertaining to sexuality, violence, or other adult concerns. They were prohibited from reading books or viewing images that could corrupt their pure minds, and adults were diligent in avoiding discussions of inappropriate subjects in their presence. Religious instruction constituted a vital component of Victorian childhood. Children attended church services, participated in family prayers, and memorized biblical verses and religious catechisms. They were taught that a divine presence was constantly observing them and that their earthly conduct would determine their eternal destiny. This spiritual framework provided the foundation for all other facets of their moral education. The transition from childhood to adulthood was marked by distinct rituals and ceremonies. For boys, this might involve commencing studies at a new educational institution, receiving their initial adult clothing, or embarking on an apprenticeship or career path. For girls, this transition was signified by their introduction into society, typically around the age of 18, at which point they would begin the process of seeking a husband. Victorian children from affluent families experienced vastly different circumstances compared to those from working-class households. Nevertheless, all were expected to adhere to the same fundamental principles regarding proper conduct and moral development. While children from wealthy backgrounds might have had governesses and tutors, those from poorer families might have worked in factories. However, all were expected to demonstrate the same virtues of obedience, self-restraint and moral integrity. The psychological repercussions of Victorian child-rearing practices were substantial. Many adults from that era grappled with the emotional distance and stringent controls they had experienced during their youth. The emphasis on suppressing natural inclinations and emotions could result in lifelong challenges with self-expression and emotional intimacy. Nonetheless, the Victorian approach to childhood also fostered numerous individuals who were highly disciplined, well-educated and capable of significant accomplishments. The focus on moral character and self-control contributed to the development of a generation of people equipped to construct and sustain the intricate social and economic frameworks that defined the Victorian era. Operating a Victorian household was akin to managing a small enterprise, complete with complex hierarchies, precise job descriptions, and elaborate systems of management and oversight. The middle and upper classes of the Victorian era were entirely reliant on domestic staff to maintain their lifestyles. However, managing these servants demanded skills that would challenge even a modern chief executive officer. The hierarchy of Victorian domestic staff was as intricate and inflexible as the social order of the broader society. At the apex was the butler, the male head of the household personnel, who supervised the other servants and oversaw the formal operational aspects of the residence. Beneath him was the housekeeper, who managed the female staff and oversaw the daily administration of the house. Following them came a descending order of specialized domestic workers: the cook, the lady's maid, the valet, the parlor maid, the housemaid, the kitchen maid, and at the very bottom, the scullery maid. Each position entailed specific responsibilities, distinct uniforms, and particular regulations concerning interactions with family members and fellow servants. The butler, for instance, was responsible for the cellar's contents, serving during formal meals and attending to important visitors at the door. He wore formal black attire and was expected to maintain a dignified and professional demeanor at all times. The housekeeper was in charge of household finances, supervised cleaning, and managed the female domestic employees. She wore black silk dresses and carried the keys to all household storage areas, symbolizing her authority. The lady's maid held perhaps the most privileged position among the female servants, as she had direct access to the mistress of the house and was responsible for her personal care. The lady's maid assisted with dressing and undressing, styled hair, maintained clothing and jewelry, and frequently served as a confidant and companion. This role necessitated considerable skill and discretion, as the lady's maid would be privy to intimate family matters and personal information. At the opposite end of the hierarchy was the scullery maid, typically a young girl tasked with the most arduous and menial duties in the kitchen. She washed dishes, scrubbed pots, cleaned floors, and performed any other tasks assigned to her by the cook or kitchen maid. The scullery maid worked extensive hours for minimal remuneration and had virtually no interaction with the family she served. Effective management of this complex hierarchy required considerable adroitness from the mistress of the house. She needed to comprehend the duties and capabilities of each servant, mediate disagreements among them, and ensure the smooth functioning of the household without becoming overly involved in minute details. This represented a delicate equilibrium. Excessive involvement could imply a lack of trust in her staff, whereas insufficient oversight might lead to disorder and inefficiency. The relationship between employers and their domestic staff was governed by elaborate codes of conduct and expectations. Servants were expected to remain unobtrusive when not directly required, to speak only when addressed, and to maintain complete discretion regarding family affairs. They had to become familiar with the family's routines, preferences, and social obligations, and they were expected to anticipate needs before being requested. The physical separation between servants and the family was carefully upheld. Servants utilized separate staircases, dined in distinct areas, and resided in separate quarters, typically in the basement or attic. They were not meant to be seen by guests unless performing their duties, and they were expected to depart swiftly and silently once their work was concluded. The servants' day commenced before dawn and concluded long after the family had retired for the night. A typical housemaid might awaken at 5 o'clock in the morning to light fires, clean hearths, and prepare the house for the family's awakening. She would labor diligently throughout the day, cleaning rooms, making beds, serving meals, and performing numerous other tasks. Her day might not conclude until 10 or 11 o'clock at night, after the family had gone to bed and all the evening's dishes had been washed and put away. The wages paid to servants were generally quite modest, but the position provided accommodation, sustenance, and a degree of security. For a considerable number of working-class individuals, domestic employment presented one of the scarce avenues to escape destitution and attain a degree of respectability. Nevertheless, the labor was arduous, the working hours were lengthy, and the societal constraints were stringent. Servants were expressly forbidden from entertaining visitors or engaging in romantic entanglements without explicit authorization from their employers. Furthermore, their movements outside the residence were restricted, necessitating permission, and their leisure time was severely curtailed. Many employers mandated church attendance for their domestics and prohibited indulgence in alcohol, gambling, or other pursuits that might cast a shadow upon the household's reputation. The instruction of domestic staff was a perpetual concern within Victorian households. Newly hired servants were tasked with not only mastering their assigned duties, but also acquainting themselves with the specific predilections and daily rhythms of the employing family. It was incumbent upon more seasoned servants to mentor newcomers, with the housekeeper or butler supervising this process to uphold established standards. The challenge of managing servants was a recurrent theme of discussion among Victorian middle-class women. Securing competent domestic help proved difficult, retaining them presented a significant challenge, and supervising them demanded unceasing vigilance. Servants might depart without prior notification, pilfer from their employers, or fail to meet expected performance benchmarks. The lady of the house bore the responsibility of constant oversight to ensure the smooth operation of your household. The economic arrangement between employers and their domestic staff was intricate. While servants received monetary wages, they were also furnished with sustenance, accommodation, apparel, uniforms, and occasionally medical attention. The aggregate value of these provisions often surpassed their actual cash remuneration. This arrangement, however, rendered servants entirely reliant on their employers for their fundamental necessities. The societal ramifications of employing domestic staff were substantial. The quantity and caliber of servants a family engaged directly mirrored their social standing and financial capacity. A household with merely one or two domestics was unequivocally less affluent than one boasting a full complement of specialized staff. The aptitude for effectively managing servants was likewise regarded as a hallmark of refined upbringing and social adeptness. The dynamic between female employers and their female servants was particularly complex. The mistress of the household was expected to provide moral guidance and oversight to her female domestics, safeguarding their virtue and ensuring their proper conduct. This fostered a quasi-maternal relationship that could be both supportive and constrictive. The domestic service system also opened pathways for social advancement, albeit with limitations. An exceptionally competent servant might ascend through the ranks to assume positions such as housekeeper or butler, roles that entailed considerable responsibility and bestowed significant respect. Some servants managed to accumulate sufficient savings to establish their own enterprises or to marry and form their own households. The decline of the domestic service system commenced in the latter part of the Victorian era and gained momentum following the First World War. As alternative employment opportunities emerged and societal perspectives began to shift, the elaborate household hierarchies that had appeared so natural and indispensable to the Victorians gradually receded, supplanted by more equitable relationships between employers and domestic workers. If a single ritual epitomized Victorian social life above all others, it was the ceremonial act of taking tea. However, Victorian tea service transcended the mere consumption of a hot beverage. It was an elaborate social rite that could extend for hours and encompassed more protocols than a diplomatic summit. The afternoon tea ritual served as the stage for Victorian society's most intricate social maneuvers, where reputations were forged and shattered, and where the subtle artistry of polite discourse attained its zenith. The custom of afternoon tea is purportedly attributed to Anna, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, in the 1840s. According to the narrative, she experienced feelings of faintness in the late afternoon, owing to the protracted interval between lunch and dinner, prompting her to arrange for tea and light refreshments to be brought to her chambers. She soon began extending invitations to friends, and the practice disseminated throughout fashionable society until it became an integral component of Victorian social engagement. Yet by the time afternoon tea became firmly established, it had evolved into something considerably more complex than a simple repast. The correct Victorian tea service necessitated specific accoutrements, particular comestibles, precise timing, and defined deportment, all of which had to be mastered by anyone aspiring to social acceptability. The tea service itself was an elaborate assembly of specialized implements. Foremost was the teapot, naturally, but it was accompanied by a hot water pot, a cream jug, a sugar bowl, a slop bowl for discarding tepid tea, tea strainers, tea caddies for storing different varieties of tea, and an array of cups, saucers, and plates in harmonious patterns. The most exquisite tea services were crafted from bone china or silver and could command a price exceeding a working man's annual income. The preparation of tea was in itself a ritual. The water was required to reach a rolling boil before being poured over the tea leaves within the pot. The tea was then left to steep for an exact duration. Insufficient steeping would result in a weak infusion, while excessive steeping would yield a bitter taste. Typically, the hostess herself undertook the preparation of the tea, as this was deemed too significant a task to delegate to servants. The serving of tea was equally ritualized. The hostess would inquire of each guest their preference for tea, whether with milk or lemon, with sugar or plain. She would then individually prepare each cup, adding the milk or lemon first, followed by the tea, and finally sugar if requested. The sequence of these actions was paramount. Introducing milk subsequent to the tea could curdle the milk, while adding lemon after milk would create an unappealing amalgamation. The accompanying refreshments served with tea were meticulously chosen and arranged. There were customarily 3 courses, savory items such as cucumber sandwiches or small meat pies, followed by sweet delicacies like cakes and pastries, and concluding with fresh fruit or nuts. Each category of food possessed its own serving implements and specific guidelines for consumption. Sandwiches were required to be cut into precise triangles or rectangles. Cakes were to be served on individual plates with appropriate forks, and all items were to be attractively presented on tiered serving stands. The conversation during tea was as carefully orchestrated as the service itself. Certain topics were deemed appropriate for tea-time discourse, while others were absolutely proscribed. Discussions concerning the weather were always acceptable, as were general inquiries about health and family matters. Literature and art were permissible subjects, provided the exchange remained light and avoided excessive intellectualism or controversy. Music was a favorite topic, particularly if a recent concert or recital had been attended. Politics, business, and religion were strictly relegated to off-limits during tea-time conversation. Anything overly personal or intimate was also forbidden. The objective was to cultivate an atmosphere of agreeable, refined sociability, where all could engage without fear of offense or embarrassment. The physical act of drinking tea was governed by precise rules of etiquette. The teacup was to be held correctly, with the thumb and forefinger encircling the handle and the middle finger providing support from beneath. The little finger was never extended, contrary to popular misconception. The saucer was to remain on the table unless one was standing, in which case it was held in the left hand while the cup was cradled in the right. When stirring tea, the spoon was moved to and fro in a straight line, never in a circular motion, and it was never to strike the sides of the cup. Following stirring, the spoon was placed on the saucer behind the cup, never left within the cup itself. When drinking, small sips were taken, and the cup was never emptied entirely. Leaving a small quantity at the bottom was considered a mark of greater refinement. The timing of afternoon tea was critical. It typically commenced at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and could extend until 6 o'clock, but guests were expected to arrive and depart within appropriate intervals. Arriving excessively early suggested undue eagerness, whereas arriving unduly late was deemed impolite. Lingering for an extended period was equally problematic, implying either a lack of social awareness or an impertinent presumption upon the hostess's hospitality. The guest list for afternoon tea was painstakingly curated to ensure congenial personalities and suitable social mingling. The hostess had to consider not only who would interact harmoniously, but also who was currently conversing with who might be affronted by some attendee's presence, and who would contribute to a lively yet appropriate exchange. The dress code for afternoon tea was specified, though not as formal as evening attire. Ladies wore afternoon dresses, which were elegant yet unostentatious, fashionable but not ostentatious. Gloves were customarily worn and removed solely for the act of eating. Hats were generally kept on, as afternoon tea was regarded as a semi-public social occasion rather than an intimate gathering. The societal implications of invitations to afternoon tea were of great consequence. Receiving an invitation to someone's regular tea circle signified social acceptance and friendship. Exclusion from tea invitations clearly signaled social disapproval. The caliber of the tea service, the elegance of the refreshments, and the sophistication of the other guests all reflected upon the hostess's social standing and discernment. For many Victorian women, afternoon tea represented one of the scarce opportunities for regular social interaction beyond their immediate family circles. It provided a forum for exchanging news, discussing social engagements, and maintaining the intricate network of relationships that defined Victorian society. It also served as a means for women to showcase their social prowess, their familiarity with etiquette, and their capacity for navigating complex social scenarios. The afternoon tea ritual also played a role in important economic functions. It created opportunities for families to showcase their affluence through costly tea sets and elaborate hospitality. This, in turn, spurred the demand for a wide array of luxury items, from fine china and rare teas to delicate confections, and fostered a network of shops, services, and artisans dedicated to serving the needs of hostesses entertaining with tea. Stepping into public life in Victorian society was akin to navigating a minefield where every gesture, glance, and utterance held the potential to jeopardize one's reputation. Behavior in public was dictated by an exceedingly intricate set of regulations that shifted based on one's gender, social standing, the time of day, the season, and even the prevailing weather conditions. A single misstep could lead to being labeled as common, improper, or socially unacceptable. For ladies of the Victorian era, simply walking down the street was a deliberate performance, demanding careful attention to posture, gait, and decorum. A lady never walked with haste. This suggested either humble origins or undue urgency. Conversely, she did not linger, as this might imply a search for inappropriate attention. The appropriate pace was a steady, dignified glide, conveying both purpose and refinement. The manner in which a lady carried herself while walking was equally crucial. Her back needed to be straight, her head held high yet not proudly, and her arms at her sides without stiffness. She was forbidden from swinging her arms or taking lengthy strides, as both were perceived as masculine and thus improper. Her skirts required meticulous management to prevent them from trailing in the dust or revealing too much of her feet and ankles. Making eye contact on the street was a delicate art. A lady could not stare at individuals as this was considered rude and forward. However, she also could not appear to deliberately avoid eye contact, which might suggest she had something to conceal. The proper approach was to look straight ahead, casting occasional brief glances at her surroundings, acknowledging acquaintances with a subtle nod, but never pausing for conversation unless circumstances were suitable. Engaging in conversation with strangers on the street was strictly forbidden for respectable ladies. Should an unknown gentleman attempt to speak with her, a lady was expected to ignore him entirely and proceed on her way. Even acknowledging such an approach could be misconstrued as an invitation and could harm her reputation. If a stranger persisted in trying to capture her attention, she was to seek refuge in the nearest reputable establishment or request assistance from a police officer. The guidelines for gentlemen, while somewhat different, were equally intricate. A gentleman was expected to tip his hat to any lady acquaintance, with the specific manner of the tip varying according to his relationship with the lady and the social context. A slight touch of the hat brim sufficed for casual acquaintances, whereas a complete removal of the hat was necessary for close friends or those of higher social standing. Gentlemen were also expected to yield to ladies on the sidewalk, offer assistance if a lady seemed to be in distress, and maintain perfect courtesy at all times. Nonetheless, they had to exercise caution to avoid appearing overly forward in offering help, as this could be perceived as presumptuous or inappropriate. Shopping presented its own array of challenges and potential social blunders. Ladies were expected to shop only during specific hours and exclusively at establishments serving respectable patrons. Their interactions with shopkeepers were carefully dictated, polite but not overly familiar, decisive but not demanding, interested but not excessively enthusiastic. Haggling was considered vulgar and was left to servants or customers of lower social standing. A respectable lady paid the asking price without objection, though she might take her business elsewhere if she deemed the prices unreasonable. She was also expected to settle her accounts promptly and to cultivate good relationships with the shopkeepers she frequented regularly. Public transportation offered numerous avenues for social missteps. Ladies traveling unaccompanied were viewed with suspicion, as respectable women were expected to be escorted by family members, friends, or servants when venturing out. The mode of transport itself conveyed social signals. Private carriages indicated affluence and status, whereas omnibuses and trains were associated with the middle and working classes. Behavior on public transport was rigorously controlled. Passengers were expected to be quiet, orderly, and considerate of others' space and comfort. Loud conversation, eating, or any behavior that drew attention was deemed inappropriate. Ladies were expected to arrange their skirts carefully to avoid occupying excessive space, while gentlemen were expected to offer their seats to ladies and elderly passengers. Attending public events such as concerts, lectures, or exhibitions necessitated a command of yet another set of behavioral norms. The manner of dress, entrance and exit from the venue, conduct during the performance, and interactions with fellow attendees were all subject to social scrutiny. Applause was regulated. Too little suggested a lack of appreciation, while too much indicated common enthusiasm. The timing of applause was also significant. Clapping at the wrong moment could mark one as ignorant of proper cultural etiquette. Conversation during performances was forbidden, but intermissions provided opportunities for social interaction that required careful navigation. Even an activity as simple as waiting for an omnibus or a train demanded proper conduct. Ladies were expected to wait patiently and quietly, never appearing anxious or impatient. They were forbidden from pacing, fidgeting, or displaying any signs of distress. Gentlemen were expected to assist ladies in boarding and to ensure their comfort during the journey. The weather introduced further complexities to public behavior. Rain necessitated specific protocols for managing umbrellas, protecting attire, and maintaining dignity while seeking shelter. Gossip circulated rapidly throughout Victorian society, and a single instance of inappropriate behavior could tarnish a person's reputation for years. Women were particularly susceptible, as their reputations were more delicate and the standards for their conduct were more stringent. In Victorian society, appearing respectable was not merely a matter of vanity, it was an economic necessity that could influence one's ability to secure employment, enter into advantageous marriages, maintain business relationships, and participate in the social circles that controlled access to opportunities and resources. The expense of maintaining a proper Victorian appearance was immense, and families frequently incurred debt or made considerable sacrifices to ensure they projected the image of respectable society. The Victorian wardrobe was not simply extensive, it was specialized to an almost absurd degree. A respectable lady required distinct ensembles for morning, afternoon and evening, different attire for various seasons, varied outfits for different social functions, and distinct accessories for each ensemble. The complexity was astonishing. Morning dresses, walking dresses, carriage dresses, visiting dresses, dinner dresses, ball gowns, opera cloaks, riding habits, traveling costumes, and morning suits, each with its own specific requirements for fabric, color, cut, and embellishment. A single evening gown could cost more than a working man's annual earnings. The finest fabrics such as silk, velvet, and lace were imported from Europe and Asia at a tremendous cost. The creation of these garments demanded skilled seamstresses who charged premium rates for their expertise, and the accessories, gloves, shoes, jewelry, fans, parasols could easily double the cost of an outfit. But here lies the truly insidious aspect. Victorian fashion evolved constantly, rendering the previous year's expensive wardrobe suddenly unfashionable and socially unacceptable. Sleeves might transition from narrow to wide, skirts from full to slim, and colors from bright to subdued, all within a single season. A lady appearing in an outdated style would be immediately identified as either impoverished, provincial, or socially oblivious, any of which could prove socially fatal. The pressure to keep pace with fashion fueled an entire industry of fashion magazines, pattern books, and style guides, dictating what individuals should wear and when. These publications were eagerly consumed by anyone hoping to maintain their social standing, fostering perpetual anxiety about whether one's appearance was sufficiently current and appropriate. For men, the situation, while different, was equally costly. The Victorian gentleman's wardrobe was more stable than women's fashion, yet it necessitated equally high-quality materials and craftsmanship. A proper gentleman required multiple suits for diverse occasions, specialized attire for sports and outdoor pursuits, formal wear for evening events, and a complete range of accessories, including hats, gloves, walking sticks, and jewelry. The quality of men's clothing was assessed by subtle details imperceptible to the untrained eye, but immediately apparent to those knowledgeable about fashion. The cut of a coat, the fabric's quality, the tailoring's precision and the accessories' suitability all conveyed immediate indications regarding a man's social standing, financial means, and adherence to decorum. The economic strain of maintaining a presentable appearance extended considerably beyond mere apparel. Personal adornment demanded a substantial outlay of both time and money. Ladies required cosmetics, though this needed subtle application to appear natural, alongside hair adornments, perfumes, and the services of hairdressers and ladies' maids. Gentlemen, in turn, needed regular visits to barbers, superior shaving implements, tonics for hair, and often the assistance of a valet to manage their grooming. The home itself served as an extension of personal presentation and necessitated continuous expenditure to uphold prevailing standards. The furnishings, decorative elements, and the overall aspect of one's dwelling were subjected to the same scrutiny as personal attire. Visitors would promptly evaluate the caliber of the furniture, the appropriateness of the decorations, and the general impression of affluence and discernment. Victorian residences required frequent redecoration to keep pace with evolving interior design trends. Wallpapers, carpets, draperies, and furniture all entered and exited fashion with the same regularity as clothing. A drawing room that appeared stylish one year might seem hopelessly antiquated the next, necessitating costly renovations to preserve the family's social position. The household staff also contributed to the family's presentation and had to be appropriately attired and trained to reflect positively upon their employers. Servants' uniforms had to be of good quality and fitting style. Furthermore, servants had to be instructed in conduct that would enhance rather than diminish the family's reputation. The carriage and horses represented another considerable expense, essential for maintaining a proper appearance. A family's carriage was a highly visible emblem of their social standing and had to be of appropriate quality and style for their societal tier. The horses needed to be well-bred and meticulously cared for. The carriage itself demanded flawless upkeep, and the coachman had to be impeccably dressed and trained. Even a family's social engagements necessitated significant financial investment. Hosting guests required costly provisions, beverages, and decorations. Attending social functions demanded suitable attire and often gifts for the hosts. Participation in charitable endeavors, which were vital for maintaining social respectability, called for both time and financial resources. The pressure to uphold appearances fostered an entire economy of credit, debt, and financial maneuvering. This gave rise to a convoluted network of financial commitments that could become burdensome should a family's fortunes wane. The market for used clothing became a significant component of the Victorian economy, as families sold their dated or unwanted garments to fund new acquisitions. Specialized establishments dealt in second-hand apparel, and services even existed to alter and update older garments, rendering them fashionable once more. The financial imperative of maintaining a proper appearance also created avenues for deceit and misrepresentation. Individuals would rent expensive clothing for special occasions, borrow jewelry and accessories, or even construct elaborate displays of prosperity devoid of actual substance. The emphasis on outward appearance over intrinsic worth enabled skilled performers to maintain social positions unsupported by their actual financial resources. The psychological toll of this incessant economic pressure was immense. Victorian diaries and correspondence are replete with anxiety surrounding finances, concerns about maintaining appearances, and apprehension of social ruin should financial difficulties come to light. The stress of preserving a respectable facade while grappling with fiscal challenges contributed to the elevated rates of mental illness and suicide that characterized the Victorian era. For women, the economic dimensions of appearance presented particular challenges owing to their limited capacity for independent earnings. A woman's appearance was often her family's responsibility, yet it also served as her primary asset in the marriage market. The investment in a daughter's wardrobe and social presentation was viewed as an investment in the family's future, as a favorable marriage could improve the entire family's social and economic standing. The gradual trend toward fashion democratization through mass production and enhanced transportation began to alter these dynamics towards the conclusion of the Victorian era. However, for the majority of the period, the expense of maintaining a proper appearance remained a substantial burden for anyone aspiring to respectability. Victorian courtship was perhaps the most stringently regulated aspect of social life, dictated by rules so intricate and contradictory that it is remarkable anyone managed to fall in love, let alone marry. The Victorians had succeeded in transforming the most natural human emotion into an elaborate game of chess, where a single misstep could jeopardize one's reputation, future, and the family's social standing. The fundamental difficulty of Victorian romance lay in its obligation to exist within a framework that simultaneously exalted love while rendering its expression exceedingly challenging. Young individuals were expected to fall in love and wed, yet they were afforded scant opportunity to acquaint themselves with one another as individuals. They were meant to select life partners based on brief, closely supervised encounters that revealed virtually nothing about personality, compatibility, or genuine affection. The process commenced with the intricate ritual of introduction. A young man could not simply approach a young woman he found appealing. That would be deemed improper and potentially scandalous. Instead, he was required to be formally introduced by a mutual acquaintance, preferably one of good social standing, who could attest to his character and intentions. This introduction had to occur in an appropriate venue, such as a social gathering, a church event, or a formal visiting situation. Once an introduction had been facilitated, the young man could initiate the elaborate process of courtship, but every progression was meticulously regulated and observed. He could visit the young woman at her family's residence, but only during specified hours and invariably in the presence of a chaperone. He could accompany her to social functions, but again only with appropriate supervision and exclusively to events deemed suitable for unmarried couples. Conversations between courting couples were strictly confined to innocuous general topics. Personal feelings, future aspirations, and anything remotely intimate were prohibited until the relationship had advanced to a formal engagement. Young people had to learn to convey their interest and affection through subtle gestures, meaningful glances, and carefully chosen words that could express emotion without breaching the norms of propriety. Physical contact was virtually forbidden. A young man might offer his arm to escort a young woman, but even this straightforward gesture required correct execution and engagement only in suitable circumstances. Holding hands was considered exceptionally intimate and was generally reserved for engaged couples. Kissing prior to engagement was absolutely scandalous and could permanently tarnish a young woman's reputation. The role of chaperones was paramount in Victorian courtship. These were typically elder women, mothers, aunts, or family friends, whose responsibility it was to ensure that no impropriety transpired between the courting couple. The chaperone had to be present at all times when the couple was together and vigilant for any indications of inappropriate conduct or excessive intimacy. However, chaperones were not merely guardians of virtue, they also acted as facilitators of romance. A skilled chaperone could create opportunities for meaningful dialogue, arrange seating conducive to the couple's interaction, and even offer subtle encouragement when she deemed the match suitable. The most adept chaperones balance protection with promotion, ensuring propriety while permitting romance to flourish. The language of flowers and other coded communication systems became indispensable tools for Victorian lovers who needed to articulate sentiments that could not be expressed verbally. A carefully selected bouquet could convey complex emotions and intentions, while the manner a fan was held or a glove was worn could transmit subtle messages understood only by the intended recipient. Letters also served as a vital means of communication for courting couples. Yet even these were subject to stringent regulations and potential censorship. Love letters had to be meticulously composed to avoid any content that might be deemed improper if read by parents or other family members. Numerous Victorian love letters, appearing stilted and formal by contemporary standards, were in reality passionate communications veiled in acceptable language. The transition from courtship to engagement was signified by specific ceremonies and rituals. The young man was obliged to formally request the young woman's father's permission to propose marriage. This discussion served as a crucial assessment of the suitor's character, intentions, and financial standing. The father would evaluate not only the young man's current situation, but also his potential for future success and his capacity to support a wife and family. If the father gave his assent, the young gentleman could then present his formal proposal to the young lady. This had to be conducted with proper decorum, typically on bended knee, accompanied by a carefully prepared speech and a ring, although engagement rings were not as ostentatious as those seen today. The proposal itself was often somewhat anticlimactic, as the couple would have already conveyed their mutual interest through the subtle channels available to them. Upon becoming engaged, the couple enjoyed a slightly increased degree of freedom in their interactions, but they remained subject to close supervision and societal judgment. They were permitted to spend brief periods together without a chaperone. They could exchange more personal correspondence and begin to make arrangements for their shared future. Nevertheless, any indication of undue familiarity or inappropriate conduct could still lead to disgrace and social exclusion. The engagement period served not only for wedding preparations but also allowed families to more thoroughly assess the suitability of the match. Engagements could be dissolved if significant issues emerged, though this was considered a serious matter that could negatively impact both parties' reputations and future marital prospects. The entirety of the Victorian courtship system was designed to ensure that marriages were founded on social suitability and familial approval rather than passionate affection. While romantic sentiments were not discouraged, they were considered secondary to practical considerations such as social standing, financial stability, and moral character. This approach to romance exerted considerable pressure on young individuals to adhere to expectations that might not align with their personal desires or inclinations. Many Victorian unions proved successful and joyful, yet they often resembled carefully negotiated partnerships more than ardent love affairs. The emphasis on propriety and societal endorsement meant that individual preferences and emotional needs were frequently subordinate to familial and social expectations. The psychological consequences of these constraints were substantial. Numerous Victorians grappled with the conflict between their inherent desires and the societal expectations imposed upon them. The intricate rules and limitations fostered an atmosphere of repression and unease, which could impede genuine intimacy. Even within marriage, Victorian society transformed every significant life event into an elaborate theatrical production, complete with specific attire, meticulously planned actions, and complex social customs that demanded strict adherence. Whether commemorating a birth, a wedding, or mourning a death, Victorians converted personal experiences into public spectacles that reinforced social hierarchies and showcased cultural values. Births within Victorian families were surrounded by elaborate rituals that commenced long before the child's arrival and extended for months thereafter. The expecting mother was expected to withdraw from public life during the later stages of her pregnancy, as her condition was regarded as too delicate and private for public display. This period of seclusion could persist for several months, during which the woman would receive only close family members and intimate friends. The actual delivery was attended by a midwife or, in affluent families, a physician, along with female relatives and friends who offered support and aid. Men, including the father, were excluded from the birthing chamber, as childbirth was considered exclusively a female domain. The birth itself was often a perilous and distressing experience due to limited medical knowledge and minimal pain relief. Once the infant was born, a new series of rituals commenced. The baby had to be baptized within a few weeks of birth, and this ceremony necessitated careful planning and preparation. The selection of godparents was paramount, as these individuals would assume significant roles in the child's life, and their choice reflected the family's social connections and ambitions. The baptismal ceremony itself was an elaborate affair that demonstrated the family's social standing and religious devotion. The baby was dressed in a special christening gown, often fashioned from the finest materials and adorned with intricate lace and embroidery. These gowns frequently served as family heirlooms, passed down through generations and meticulously preserved for each new infant. The celebration following the baptism offered another occasion for social demonstration. The family would host a reception for friends and relatives, serving special foods and beverages that highlighted their prosperity and hospitality. The gifts bestowed upon the baby were carefully chosen to reflect the giver's relationship with the family and their assessment of the child's future prospects. Weddings were arguably the most elaborate of all Victorian celebrations, requiring months of preparation and substantial expenditure. The engagement duration was utilized not only for planning the ceremony, but also for assembling the bride's trousseau, the extensive collection of clothing, linens, and household items she would bring to her marriage. The wedding ceremony itself was a meticulously orchestrated event that adhered to stringent protocols. The bride wore white, a tradition popularized by Queen Victoria, and her gown was often the most expensive garment she would ever possess. The groom and his attendants donned formal mourning attire, and every facet of their appearance was carefully considered and executed. The wedding reception provided another venue for social display, featuring elaborate decorations, costly refreshments, and entertainment that reflected the family's social status and financial means. The guest list was carefully curated to include all appropriate relatives, friends, and social acquaintances, while excluding anyone whose presence might be considered improper or controversial. The honeymoon, while a relatively novel concept in the Victorian era, rapidly became an integral part of the wedding ritual. The chosen destination for the honeymoon conveyed messages regarding the couple's social standing and cultural sophistication. A sojourn in Europe represented the ultimate status symbol, whereas a trip to a fashionable domestic resort was more typical for couples of the middle class. Funerals were equally elaborate occasions that could entail considerable expense and months of planning. The Victorian approach to mortality was characterized by intricate mourning rituals that served both to honor the deceased and to showcase the family's social standing and emotional devotion. The funeral service itself was a meticulously choreographed event that followed strict protocols. The deceased was laid in state in the family home for several days prior to the funeral, affording friends and relatives the opportunity to pay their respects. The coffin was often ornate and costly, crafted from fine woods and embellished with silver or brass fittings. The funeral procession constituted a public display of the family's sorrow and social connections. The number and quality of carriages in the procession, the throng of mourners in attendance, and the opulence of the floral tributes all reflected the deceased's social importance and the family's resources. The cemetery evolved into a significant social space during the Victorian era, featuring elaborate monuments and regular visits from mourning families. Victorian cemeteries were designed as parks where families could spend time with their departed loved ones. The monuments themselves became opportunities for artistic and social expression. The mourning period that ensued after a death was an extended ritual that could span years and involved detailed regulations concerning attire, conduct, and social engagements. The duration and intensity of mourning varied according to the deceased's relationship, but it invariably entailed significant limitations on normal social activities. Even smaller celebrations and observances were subject to intricate rules and expectations. Birthday parties, holiday festivities, and social gatherings each possessed their own protocols and requirements. The manner in which these events were planned and executed reflected the host's social adeptness, cultural understanding, and attention to proper form. The seasonal social calendar represented another critical element of Victorian celebratory culture. The London social season, which extended from Easter to August, comprised a meticulously organized series of events, including balls, receptions, garden parties, and other assemblies. Participation in the social season was indispensable for maintaining one's standing in fashionable society, and the events themselves provided opportunities for social networking, matchmaking, and cultural display. The elaborate nature of Victorian celebrations and observances served multiple purposes. They provided structure and significance to momentous life events, they reinforced social hierarchies and cultural values, and they created avenues for families to demonstrate their affluence, discernment, and social connections. However, they also generated immense pressure to conform to expectations and could prove financially and emotionally draining for the families involved. By the 1890s, discernible fissures began to appear within the elaborate structure of Victorian social conventions. The very complexity that had rendered the system so effective at preserving social order was simultaneously rendering it increasingly untenable. Emerging technologies, shifting economic circumstances, and evolving societal attitudes all contributed to a gradual erosion of the rigid behavioral codes that had defined respectable society for over half a century. The bicycle, of all things, emerged as one of the most subversive influences in Victorian society. When the safety bicycle was introduced in the 1880s, it bestowed upon individuals, particularly women, a novel sense of mobility that proved difficult to govern according to traditional social norms. A woman riding a bicycle could not maintain the slow, dignified pace that was expected of a proper lady. She could not don the intricate, confining attire that Victorian fashion dictated, nor could she be continuously accompanied while traversing the countryside by bicycle. The bicycle necessitated new types of clothing, shorter skirts, more functional fabrics, and less restrictive undergarments. It fostered physical activity and autonomy in ways that challenged prevailing notions of feminine fragility and dependency. Critics of the time cautioned that cycling would render women too masculine, too self-sufficient, and too physically robust for their designated roles as spouses and mothers. The telephone emerged as another technology that disrupted established social protocols. Victorian visiting customs were predicated upon physical presence, formal introductions, and meticulous observation of social standings. The telephone permitted direct communication, bypassing the elaborate intermediary steps previously required. Young individuals could converse without chaperones. Business transactions could be conducted without formal calls, and social connections could flourish outside the traditional frameworks of family and community supervision. The proliferation of department stores and mass-produced articles began to democratize fashion and consumption, thereby challenging conventional indicators of social status. As ready-made clothing became widely available, distinguishing between the genuinely affluent and those merely adept at projecting an image of prosperity grew more difficult. The elaborate dress codes that had reliably signified social position lost their meaning when similar styles could be acquired at varying price points. The expansion of educational opportunities, particularly for women, introduced new challenges to established social structures. As more women attained education and intellectual engagement, the limitations placed upon their conversations and activities became increasingly untenable. Women who had delved into literature, science, or philosophy found it vexing to confine their discourse to pleasantries and the weather, as Victorian etiquette prescribed. The emerging New Woman movement of the 1890s explicitly contested many of the foundational assumptions underpinning Victorian social mandates. These women championed enhanced independence, professional prospects, and personal liberty. They rejected the notion that women should be passive, reliant, and primarily concerned with domestic affairs. They asserted their right to participate in public life, to pursue careers, and to make autonomous decisions regarding marriage and family. The economic transformations of the late Victorian period also contributed to the unraveling of traditional social rules. The burgeoning industrial capitalism generated novel forms of wealth that did not align neatly with existing social hierarchies. Prosperous businessmen and industrialists may have possessed greater financial means than hereditary aristocrats, but they lacked the cultural capital and social connections that had previously defined respectability. The expansion of the middle class created a larger segment of individuals who aspired to respectability, but found the conventional rules increasingly burdensome and expensive to uphold. The elaborate hosting, extensive wardrobes, and intricate social rituals that had been manageable for a select elite became overwhelming when attempted by a much broader populace. World War I delivered the final blow to numerous Victorian social conventions. The conflict necessitated women assuming novel roles and responsibilities incongruent with traditional views of feminine delicacy and reliance. Women toiled in factories, operated ambulances, and undertook professional duties previously reserved for men. The ornate dress codes, complicated social rituals, and restrictive behavioral expectations of the Victorian era seemed increasingly irrelevant in the face of wartime exigencies. The immense casualties of the war also disrupted the social networks and familial structures that had underpinned Victorian society. Many of the young men who would have constituted the subsequent generation of social leaders perished in the trenches. Families that had upheld the elaborate social rituals were devastated by loss and no longer possessed the emotional fortitude or financial capacity to continue past practices. The post-war era witnessed a deliberate repudiation of many Victorian values and customs. The younger generation, traumatized by the conflict and disillusioned with the society that had produced such devastation, embraced new forms of music, fashion, and behavior that explicitly challenged Victorian propriety. The elaborate social rules that had once seemed natural and essential now appeared contrived and oppressive. However, the legacy of Victorian social rules did not vanish entirely. Many of the fundamental principles of politeness, consideration for others, and social responsibility embedded within Victorian etiquette continued to shape behavior long after the specific rules were discarded. The concept of presenting oneself to the world matters. The understanding that social relationships demand careful attention and upkeep, and the recognition that appropriate and inappropriate conduct exists in differing situations. These ideas persevered even as their particular manifestations evolved. Contemporary etiquette guides still echo many Victorian principles, albeit adapted to present-day circumstances. The emphasis on being considerate of others, the significance of making individuals feel at ease in social settings, and the notion that good manners are a form of respect for fellow human beings, these are all Victorian concepts that continue to influence our perspectives on proper conduct. The Victorian preoccupation with appearance and social performance also left an enduring imprint on modern culture. The idea that success requires not only competence but also the ability to present oneself appropriately, that social aptitudes are as crucial as technical proficiencies, and that initial impressions hold considerable weight, these are all Victorian concepts that remain pertinent today. The Victorian approach to social relationships, the meticulous attention to hierarchy, the elaborate rituals of introduction and courtship, the intricate webs of obligation and reciprocity also continue to shape our thinking about social interaction, albeit in significantly modified forms. Modern networking, dating customs, and professional relationships all bear traces of Victorian social patterns. Perhaps most significantly, the Victorian era showcased both the efficacy and the constraints of social rules as a method of societal organization. The elaborate codes of conduct prevalent in the Victorian era succeeded in fostering a stable, ordered society capable of remarkable achievements in science, technology, literature, and the arts. Yet, they also imposed considerable pressure on individuals to conform to expectations that might not align with their personal aspirations or capabilities. Ultimately, they proved too rigid and complex to endure the social and economic transformations of the 20th century. The Victorian experience suggests that social rules are most effective when they address genuine social needs and can adapt to evolving circumstances. When rules become objectives in themselves rather than means to social harmony and cooperation, they transform from facilitators into impediments to human well-being. And so, we arrive at the conclusion of our exploration through the intricate realm of Victorian social rules. We have uncovered a society that was simultaneously admirable and peculiar, sophisticated and stifling, elegant and exhausting. The Victorians constructed a social framework of unparalleled complexity and refinement. However, they also created a world where a misplaced fork could damage one's reputation, and a poorly timed visit could sever a friendship. The Victorian era serves as a reminder that social rules are not natural laws, but human constructs designed to fulfill specific purposes in particular times and places. The elaborate etiquette of the Victorian era served important functions. It provided structure and predictability in a world undergoing rapid change. It created avenues for social mobility while preserving social order. Furthermore, it established standards of conduct that fostered courtesy, consideration, and mutual respect. Nevertheless, the Victorian experience also highlights the perils of allowing social rules to become excessively rigid, overly complex, and too detached from authentic human needs and desires. When form supersedes substance, when performance overshadows the individual, when rules serve the system rather than the people within it, then social conventions morph into social prisons. The legacy of the Victorian era is multifaceted and paradoxical. We can admire the elegance, refinement, and meticulousness that characterized Victorian society, while simultaneously acknowledging the oppression, anxiety, and artificiality that these same qualities could engender. We can appreciate the Victorian emphasis on courtesy, consideration, and social responsibility, while also valuing the greater freedom and authenticity that emerged with the abandonment of their more restrictive mandates. Perhaps the most salient lesson we can glean from the Victorian era is that social rules ought to promote human flourishing rather than restrict it. The most beneficial social conventions are those that assist individuals in treating each other with respect and kindness, that foster opportunities for meaningful connection and collaboration, and that adapt to changing circumstances and evolving human requirements. The Victorians might have elevated societal conventions to a degree that seems almost unbelievable nowadays, yet their fundamental understanding that our interactions with one another carry weight, that social connections demand mindfulness and dedication, and that the fabric of society hinges on our readiness to acknowledge the requirements and emotions of others, persists with just as much significance now as it did within the parlors and tea rooms of the 19th century.